One of the more interesting topics for probably the past 10 years in video games is, of course, retro video game collecting. It really spurred on this whole new life cycle. It became this huge, massive thing where now there's conventions dedicated to just retro video games and retro video game sales. But over the past few years, you've kind of seen a bit of a decline when it comes to the retro game market. Prices are starting to flatline, people are starting to be a little bit less interested in it, and a lot of people are starting to get this impression that retro video game collecting and retro video games in general are becoming worthless or useless in a monetary stance. Smash JT, which is a fellow YouTube channel, actually made a video on this, and he wanted different people's opinions on it because he shared his opinions on it, and I thought it was a very interesting topic. So I've kind of been mulling this over and thinking about it and thinking about why I got into collecting, and there's definitely a lot of things I want to say about retro video game collecting in 2019. So is the retro video game bubble bursting? Is it time to sell all of your retro video games, or is there different reasons to collect retro video games? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. So sit back, relax, make sure you subscribe to the channel and like the video, and let's talk about retro video games in 2019 and whether it's time to sell them all or not.
Hey, RG385. Hey, Sean.
Oh my God, it's Stevie Richards! So the retro video game collecting scene has obviously been around for quite a while now. It's something that's definitely thrust into the limelight, and you have conventions and events dedicated to retro video game collecting, whether it's trading video games, selling video games, or just sort of celebrating retro video games. And for me, I've been collecting games since probably about 2004, 2005, but I would say it got sort of hardcore around 2010. Between 2005 and 2010, like, I was just sort of collecting stuff, but I ended up having to sell some stuff when I was in between jobs. But after 2010, I just sort of decided to keep everything that I was buying, all of these retro video games. And a lot of people got into retro video game collecting for a variety of different reasons, and I think that's an important part about this topic as far as these retro video games becoming useless or having no value to them when you're talking about retro video game collecting. I pretty much got into retro game collecting just because I liked collecting video games. I liked buying video games, and I liked checking out video games. I was definitely very into the NES scene, which I think a lot of people were into the NES scene when retro video game collecting sort of started taking off, because that was definitely one of the higher ranking as far as price is concerned retro video game markets. You know, NES games were selling for very, very high. There was a very high demand for them, but I never really paid exorbitant amounts of money for my NES games. I was getting my NES games through just like bulk lots from local people. Like, you'd get like 50 games for 80 bucks or 100 bucks, and yeah, you got some duplicates and things like that, but I would just sell off my duplicates to sort of recoup the money from buying these lots. And that's how I sort of built up my NES collection. And after I started buying NES stuff, I started collecting for other systems, either systems that I really liked as a kid growing up, or systems that I just wasn't super familiar with. Things like the Sega CD. I never had a Sega CD as a kid, so to be able to play these Sega CD games, you know, as an adult and be able to experience them was a very unique experience. The Sega Saturn, I had a Sega Saturn as a kid. I had a lot of the great games for the Sega Saturn because a lot of places were liquidating these games. So to be able to collect for the Sega Saturn, another sort of off the path, off the cuff sort of system, was a very cool thing for me. But as I started collecting games, a lot of other people started collecting games. It almost became like a trend. It almost became something that was like popular, where everyone was starting to collect games. And I think one of the things that you have to talk about when you're talking about collecting video games is, why are people collecting video games? I think some people collect video games for different reasons. There are definitely different reasons why people collect video games. For me, it was always just about having the games. It was always just about experiencing the games and having fun with these games. I was never really paying exorbitant prices for these video games. I was always trying to get them cheap, kind of like how I do with games now. So it was never about trying to spend top dollar or have like an e-peen and show off my hardcore video games that I paid an exorbitant amount of money for. But other people definitely got into the video game collecting scene as a monetary thing. They wanted to be able to buy these games at low prices and then resell them. And the rise of resellers really became a big and prevalent thing. Now, I don't hate resellers. I totally understand it. If you're buying a bulk of video games and you got it for really cheap and you need some money and you want to sell these games, that's your prerogative, because at the end of the day, none of this stuff has value unless somebody gives it value. And that's something something that a lot of people just seem to forget. You know, if I have a copy of Super Mario Brothers and it's worth $10, but I sell it for $100 and somebody pays me $100 for it, to that person, that game is worth $100. But to the average person, it's not worth that. And that's what sort of dictates any sort of economy when it comes to video games and video game collecting, is what people are willing to pay for it. If someone is selling a game and they have this game forever and it's not selling at a set price, if they're smart, they're going to lower that price, which would then change the economy and shift the economy of the video game marketplace. I never really cared about the monetary aspect though. I know a lot of people do care about the monetary aspect, and I feel like the people who are most sort of intimidated by the potential retro game bubble bursting and now it's time to sell your video games are the ones that are in this for the monetary reasons. Now that's not to say that you can't get into the retro game market because of monetary reasons. There are still massive conventions that happen each and every year. More and more conventions pop up each and every year. There's more and more retro game stores that are popping up as well. So to say that the retro game market is bursting is, I think, completely false. If anything, it's just sort of changing. And you see this year after year after year, and I'm kind of surprised that more people do not pick up on this. What ends up happening is you have people that collect for systems from when they were a kid. That's why in the 2000s, NES collecting was so popular, because the people that grew up with the NES started having jobs and started having room to collect these NES games. So they had additional income where they could spend that income on whatever they wanted. So they started collecting NES games. And since then, it's just sort of been a shift from system to system. Right now, PS2 stuff is very, very hot. PS2 systems are selling like crazy. Why do you think that is? It's because the people that grew up as the PS2 with their first system now have expendable income to where they can collect and repurchase a PS2. Now there's a whole nother market when it comes to retro video games, such as the classic system market. And classic systems and compilations are definitely readily available for a lot of consumers. I have pretty much every classic console that they have released. The NES Classic, the Super Nintendo Classic. I'm getting a TurboGrafx Classic. I have all of these compilations. I have things like the Sega Genesis Classics collection where I could play these games. And then of course you have emulators where you can just play games in your web browser nowadays and experience any retro game you want. So what's the point of collecting for some people? I can't really speak for other people because I don't know how their mind works or how they think when it comes to collecting video games. But for me, as far as collecting video games is concerned, it's almost like a time capsule. It's almost like it's bringing you back to a place in time when you were a little kid playing this video game. Or maybe if you didn't experience this video game, sitting in front of the television playing this video game for the first time brings back memories that you never had of this game, but then you create your own memories. Take for example these arcade one-ups behind me. I have a Mortal Kombat one, a Street Fighter one, and a Final Fight one. Now as a kid, if you would have told me that I would have had an arcade version of Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter 2 in my house as an adult, I would have thought you were absolutely crazy. But what this does is it allows me to sort of revisit a place in time where arcades were popular, a place in time where you wanted to go to the arcades to play the latest and greatest games, and it's just something that's completely forgotten. It's something that doesn't exist anymore. And for me, that's always been what video game collecting has been all about. The monetary aspect was just sort of a secondary thing. Obviously, I don't sell a lot of video games, and I have duplicates of things like that, but I'm just not interested in selling games. If it came down to it, if I had to sell video games to make money or to get some sort of monetary stuff, would I do it? I mean, of course, like, you can't just hoard this stuff forever. If you need to sell this stuff to make money, to be able to eat, to be able to pay your bills, then yes, you have to sell this stuff. You know, I do have emotional attachments to a lot of these games. I do have a reason to collect these games because it sort of reminds me of a time and place that maybe I wasn't in, or maybe I was in as a kid. You take, for instance, the Sega Master System. That's probably the one system that I somewhat actively collect for in 2019 because it's just a very interesting system. It's a system that I did not have as a kid. It's a system that I did not get to experience as a kid. So playing all of these Sega Master System games that are completely foreign and new to me is just a really unique experience to sort of bring you back to this place in time where this system was alongside of the NES, but it was arguably better in terms of graphics than the NES. Could it have shifted the video game landscape? It's just fun to think about things like that when you're playing retro video games. At the end of the day, people got into video games and video game collecting for different reasons, and I think that's a very important important thing to take away from this video is you can't really judge someone else's reason. If they got into it for strictly monetary stuff because they are a reseller, great. People need to buy video games. People need to have access to video games. Yeah, it sucks that you didn't get that video game for $1 and now you have to pay the reseller $50, but that's, at the end of the day, that's just capitalism. That's supply and demand. Nothing has a value unless you give it a value. If you collect video games because you want to go back to a place in time where you were a kid and experiencing these video games again, that's a great reason too. I don't think there's any right or wrong reason to collect video games. Do I think the market is sort of setting on the secondary retro video game market? I really don't. I think it's just sort of changing. Yeah, prices will eventually get lower for stuff, and a lot of games have peaked when it comes to how much they are worth and how much people are willing to spend for them. But as far as a drastic drop in these prices, I just don't see it happening anytime soon. People like to have a physical collection. If things like the NES Classic, the Super Nintendo Classic, and emulation didn't kill off retro video game sales, the only thing that will actually kill off retro video game sales is time. You know, in 20 years, are people going to care about these NES games as much as they do nowadays? Probably not. And I think that'll be a very interesting topic and a very interesting thing to sort of revisit back in that time if I'm still on YouTube in 20 years, if YouTube is still a thing, if the internet is still as it is. Like, you can't predict the future at the end of the day. So if you want to collect video games, collect video games. If you want to sell all your video games, sell all your video games. At the end of the day, it's your stuff. Do what you want with it. So I want to thank Smash JT for making his little first video and all the people that have responded to it. Make sure you guys check out Smash's video. I'll have it in the description box down below. But those are just my 2 cents on retro video game collecting, how I sort of see the marketplace in 2019 and potentially beyond, why I got into retro video game collecting, and is it time to sell all your retro video games? And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Check out other videos on the channel, and as always, I will catch you guys on the next video. Later.